Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you again for Curious Conversations. I'm delighted today to be speaking to my wonderful colleague, Chris Munro. Chris is the Managing Director of Growth Coaching International, looking after all of our work in across Australia and New Zealand. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Chris probably for, must be 6-7 years now. And it's just been a wonderful time of getting to know Chris. And Chris is a wonderful leader. As everyone knows, it's some challenging times we're experiencing now. And Chris is just the most wonderful person to work with during this kind of a time. And but one of the favorite things I like to do is have these kinds of conversations with Chris. So welcome, Chris, and very much looking forward to having this kind of conversation with you.
Thanks, Christian. Thank you, and thank you for your kind words. Yeah, this is another one of those pinch myself moments. I've often say to people in our workshops, I've got my dream job and I get to work with people who are academic heroes, but we won't spend this whole conversation kind of bigging each other up and so on. You're absolutely right. I think I used a very Aussie phrase at one point that we need to have one of those nutting it out conversations. It's become our little phrase that occasionally there'll be something, and I've mentioned this to others, there'll be something that we'll say in a meeting or something we'll say in a discussion forum with our colleagues. And your response, when I know it's time for one of those conversations, your response is, we need to talk about that. And it's chewing on an issue or chewing on some kind of provocation or stimulus for that conversation. So this one, tonight for me and today for you, by the wonder of these time zones, is that notion of a continuum of developmental conversations. And I think I've probably changed the title again in thinking about it for tonight, from what we put out there as a promotion for this. But how we see developmental conversations on a continuum, and where we've arrived at in that journey. You're quite right. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago when I was doing this kind of stuff in school, that we met in Melbourne at one point. You gave me a bit of your time, and you were teaching on the UEL Masters program at the time, and wanted to go back and share the work we were doing in school there. So, and little did I know, we're sitting here as colleagues now. So yeah, that's the topic for tonight, a curious conversation about this notion of a continuum of developmental conversations.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm really excited. I think we've got participants from all over who have joined to attend this. And I just wanted to say a little bit about the format, and before we kind of dive into the topic. So what we're doing, it is genuinely a real live conversation. This is something Chris and I have both been thinking deeply about. So if you're watching this conversation, our invitation is for you just to almost sit as if you're listening in to us having this conversation. But as any questions emerge, I'd invite you to use the question and answer feature on this webinar, just to type in any questions that come up for you, or any, particularly what we're interested in, I think, is how some of the things we're talking about may relate to your own professional practice. So questions like, I wonder how that concept would apply to me as a teacher, as a leader, as another member of the school team or university or college team. So I guess that's my recommendation. And then at a point in the conversation, Chris and I will turn to those questions to see which ones are going to be helpful for us to include in our conversation. So I hope that's okay. So let's start off, Chris, by just exploring, because I guess you and I had the opportunity to talk about many number of things, and I said how much I enjoy having these, and we both call them nutting it out conversations, really kind of grappling and tussling with it, those kinds of conversations. We could have picked one of probably 20 or 30 regulars that pop up.
There's a list. Yeah.
In your case, what are the reasons for selecting this topic?
I think this is, when we talked about topics for these, we thought, what kind of topics have we been due to have a conversation about? This is foremost, and I think what we're going to talk about here is fundamental to what we do in trying to help people understand developmental conversations, how coaching in different forms or approaches to coaching sits in that, in relation to other professional conversations that might be more about feedback or giving directives, or in mentoring and different titles and these emerging roles and skills that are about helping people. That's something that I've been, use the word tussling with there for a significant portion of my professional life, and now I do it as a specialism, I suppose, that in previous careers in professional development and leading professional development in schools, in initial teacher education, when the word coaching wasn't in the landscape for me, I then came to Australia in 2011 and came across this word coaching in an education context, and went through the process that lots of us go through in education of wrestling with labels, job titles, definitions, looking for clarity on coaching, mentoring, you name it, everything in between. And eventually, I think, and I said this to you in a nutshell last year at our national conference, reaching what I think is appropriate to call a level of maturity in the coaching and education field, the way we articulated across a whole range of speakers and workshops, from yourself, Jim Knight, myself and others, Rachel Lofthouse, all the thought leaders there in coaching and education. There was an articulation of the nuance of these kinds of conversations in schools. The late great Tony Grant as well, we should mention there as well, that there was a comfort with that, and I'm doing this again, that continuum of approaches to the conversations. And I think early on, when I started grappling with this back in 2010, 2011, it was a struggle, it was a tussle. And I think we've reached that clarity, nuance, comfort with that, rather than constantly seeking precise definitional clarity. So I think that's why it's worth exploring, and maybe will generate some thinking for others that are listening in.
Excellent. That I think that you've reminded me of one of my reasons as well, which was that I did think that conference, there was that level of sophistication it was the event itself, and it was the people at the event. It was just as a group of, people who were interested in coaching and education. I thought we were having a really useful conversation about conversations, and the different types of conversations we have. And I guess my initial interest in this is, first of all, Growth Coaching International, I guess that's what we're all about. We're all about enhancing the quality of conversations. So understanding how conversations work is central to what we do. And so that's why I guess you and I spend a lot of time thinking about this. On the one hand, that's what we do as Growth Coaching International. But on the other hand, when I reflect back to what got me interested in this tussle in the first place, was the realization, or just the awareness of the fact that in educational institutions, there's just, how many conversations are there in every day? That idea of there's hundreds of conversations. And perhaps for educators, leaders in education, the awareness of the different types of conversations and the ability to have the right conversations with the right people at the right time. I think that's why I thought, well, I'm particularly interested in this. And, I also stumbled across coaching, and to say, well, I wonder if this is something. So yeah, I guess that's what's brought us to this.
Yeah, it's good. So I think as a way of maybe leading into this notion of a continuum, it might be helpful for us to look at where it kind of started, this word, this notion of continuum, and it's still contentious. It's still, well, not contentious. Contentious is too strong. There's still debate around that term, and with some of our colleagues as well, and then some of our other professionals in that area, this notion of sliding or moving, and metaphorically, I think that's important. It's not just a way of putting things on a line. It's not just terminal points, and sometimes when we've presented it in certain ways graphically, people see the things at either end of that continuum as being dichotomous and are not necessarily. So regardless of how we present this, and we've agreed we're not putting any graphics up tonight, just so that we don't mix the message. It's actually a conversation about it. That's one of the pitfalls of trying to do that. And you know, I love a good diagram more than most. So there are some to come later at some stage. So maybe a starting point might be, I've got, this is going to look like shameless plugs here, Christian's book, but your first book in coaching and education, called Coaching and Education, in 2012, 2012. There's right near the start, there's a section there where you're, as most coaching books do, trying to clarify the difference between, there's even a mention of sports coaching here, but coaching and mentoring in particular, because that's often they're conflated, they're conjoined, they're confused, you know, all these kind of words and terms, and it leads to frustration. And you had things in there about formality and engagement and so on, but then this was the first place we saw, or I was aware of seeing, coaching and mentoring continuum, as you've called it there. Maybe that would be a useful starting point for you to talk about the directive, non-directive kind of elements of that.
Yeah, well, thank you for showing that book. I was looking in my library I don't have a copy of it, so I just thought I have to find that again. But I'll show a book as well, and this isn't shameless plugging now, because this is probably the person who most influenced my thinking about. Miles Downey wrote a wonderful book called Effective Coaching, Lessons from the Coach's Coach. And Miles Downey is one of the, you know, along with the late Sir John Whitmore, one of the main figures in the development of coaching, particularly in the UK context. So actually just hearing you now, Chris, say sports coaching, I'd actually forgotten that I'd included references to sports coaching there, but you know, going back to, because it was 2010 when I was writing it, it does take a little while for these things to get published. Back in 2010, I wanted to start off from things we knew were happening in all schools or most schools. So I was thinking, well, in every school, there is sports coaching going on. So it's a great jumping off point. Because sports coaching is about getting the best out of people. But there are differences between sports coaching and the kind of coaching we're talking about. So I wanted to use that as a jumping off point. And then I also wanted, that's why mentoring was in there, because I was thinking, well, pretty much all of the schools that I interacted with in the United Kingdom, at least, they had mentors. So mentoring was an often used term and was being used, you know, the whole range of being used very effectively and with impact, and also being used sometimes less effectively. So I thought that would be a good starting off point. And having learned about coaching myself not that many years before, the work of Miles Downey and others was pretty fresh in my mind. But you've really, I think you've already hit on the head. One of the big issues here is we're trying to talk about something really quite complex and dynamic, and anytime. So now when I look back at that graph of 2012, I'm thinking in my attempts to be clear, and that's again a tension I've got, I want to be as clear as possible and as helpful as possible. But in some ways that being too clear maybe was unhelpful, because it ends up looking like on the one end, you've got a non-directive conversation. On the other end, you have a directive conversation. And the original Continuum of Miles Downey was really about coaching skills. He was talking about coaching skills. There's some skills which are less directive, some that are more directive. And I guess what I was doing was kind of echoing that and saying that in education, that's what I was trying to do, to talk about how does it work in education. But inadvertently, I think what happened was it was almost like saying coaching is directive, non-directive, mentoring is directive. And that wasn't really so I guess the driving force wasn't to try to understand the nuance, and it was to try, you're right, because it's right at the beginning of that book, the purpose of it was to try and say what's different between coaching and mentoring. Does that make sense? It
makes sense. It does. And I think you're hitting on something there, that this is why we're now comfortable with the nuance. I think we often talk about going from, beginner coaches in our training and so on to being advanced coaches. And you've written that another plug, sorry. We'll stop mentioning books in a minute. But advanced coaching is often becoming comfortable with that nuance. It's becoming comfortable with the not knowing. It's been comfortable that we can be responsive in the moment and shift our stance, but we do it very intentionally. It's not shapeless. And for beginner coaches, that takes a long time to get to that and lots of practice. And in some ways, our understanding of something as complex and dynamic as this, it makes sense that takes time to get to that level of comfort with. And it's not even multiple definitions. It's that I can be all of those things, all of those roles, if you want to compartmentalize them as roles or labels or titles. But I think there's a natural tendency in us to hang our hat on a definition or attach yourself to a label that resonates more with us. And what that leads to, as you've said, is you put them on a continuum at opposite ends. It looks like they're dichotomous, or that one's good and that one's bad because I'm a coach and you're a mentor. And we get all those interpretations, and none of them are helpful. But inadvertently, I think you're right, in striving to make something complex clearer, we have add sometimes to the confusion. I think there's another little bit I want to pick up on what you said there, that I've moved in one of the versions that we've looked at the development of this continuum is the words directive and non-directive. And the word directive to some can be a pejorative term. And it has all sorts of negative connotations, like giving directives. I'm taking control and I'm doing, reducing your level of autonomy and so on. And in some of the versions latterly that I've talked about, it's a bit gentler to say more directive towards that end and less directive towards that end. And that's about what we mean by the words directive in a developmental context. So I think that's important. Right back to what you said at the start. If we're talking about developmental, growth-orientated conversations with professional colleagues who are always striving to get better at doing what we do, then we're not talking about the stuff that's performance management and giving directives for compliance reasons and so on. And they're all necessary, but that's not what we're talking about here. And we're not talking about the really non-directive other end, which might be, I don't know the right term, counseling, therapy. Even then you might say some aspects of that are a little bit directive. So it's complex. It's messy in some ways, but in some way putting them that way helps us think about where we are. I'm even swaying side to side now, aren't I? What do you think?
Great, excellent. And you've reminded me of my own development in my thinking around this. So I think the one thing that's been the most recent learning for me, and it's thanks to conversations like this, is that what we're talking about here and what we've called the continuum, and when I spoke with Professor Rachel Lufthouse at that conference we talked about it as a spectrum. But whatever language we use to talk about that, I think the big learning for me and for us as an organization is, look, Growth Coaching International, what we're interested in is developmental conversations in educational settings. That's our main focus. And so the part of the wider continuum that we're looking at is the continuum called developmental conversations, the kind of conversations that are meant to be supportive and helpful. And we're saying within that continuum, and that's the where we're putting our lens in, even within there, because it's part of that larger continuum, we have more directive conversations and less directive conversations. And, you know, more recently, I've been going out of my way to say, you know, my area of interest is coaching. I'm fascinated about it. I think it's something that we can develop further. And I'm highly respectful and appreciative of mentoring. So it's not meant to be, this is a less good or that. But the one thing you made me remember, and this was probably an attempt of mine to bring some nuance back into the fact that now it looks like a table with one thing on the other and words listed down. These are the directive intervention, these are non-directive. I used to, as you mentioned, I still teach at University of East London, but I was teaching on a module called Coaching and Education. Mm. And when we got to this discussion, and this did happen on day one because of the importance of distinguishing or understanding better the relationship between these terms, I remember printing out all of those words such as telling, instructing, advising, listening to understand, cutting them out into little bits of paper, and then bringing them to our students at University of East London and saying, look, here's the continuum and here are the words. And where would you place them? But I gave specific instruction. It's interesting in itself. I gave specific instruction to say, it's not, don't put them under this or this. This is a continuum. Whereabouts, you know, so I'm doing the swaying thing now. Whereabouts is listening to understand? Is that less directive or is it more directive? So I think that was a way of trying to bring some nuance back into this dialogue.
And I think that exercise, without being there, would end up in what you frequently call tensions arising. That people will be going, it depends. Telling, if I do telling here, I might be going more, but actually at some stage it might be helpful to tell. And they'll be going, is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? What's he going to say? Are these all in the right place? We start to get really hung up on those kinds of things. And I think if we're thinking about the conversation between me as someone who might be in a school or an education setting, who might be called any number of things. I might be called a professional learning leader. Yeah. And that's probably the broadest. I might be called a coach. I might be called a mentor. I might be called an instructional coach. I might be called a literacy coach, and any number of titles in between. We get to see lots of them in our work globally. Yeah. That in itself doesn't define the nature of the conversation, but I think there's a tendency, if it's one of those recognized ones like coach, mentor, instructional coach, there's a kind of a striving for role clarity and definitional clarity. But that's not to suggest that you don't ever take a more directive approach if you're an instructional coach or an executive coach or whatever kind of coach. Or equally, as a mentor, you don't want to be quite facilitative or less directive at the other end, because you still want that person to be taking responsibility and moving forward. I think the intent is very similar. And I think what's been helpful in some of our discussions is we've teased out the difference and we've moved away from definitions of roles or titles. And I think there's a question about that there. I want to go to the questions maybe in a little minute. We've moved away from roles and titles and trying to define the work to what are the expectations in these conversations? Yeah. Who is it serving? And what's the purpose? What's the intent of these conversations? And I think that helps then determine my mode. And one of the other sources we'll point out is the table that you and Jim Knight and John Campbell developed. And you mentioned it in last week's webinar. Yeah. That the mode of discourse will change as you move along that, and the decision-making power or status, if you want to use that term, will change as you go more directive or less directive. So I think we're starting to raise some of the other terms and nuances through this.
Yeah, what we don't want to move away from is that the intention of having these conversations is to be helpful. But I think already, just in what you were saying, which is very nuanced and very helpful, what's helping me as I'm listening to that is to say that what you're saying there about a mentor might move more towards the non-directive, or a coach might move more towards the directive. We're talking in the context of that, the smaller continuum that we're talking about. We're not saying that the coach would, tell you, give you an order. That there is, or, we can have those conversations, but that's part of the wider continuum. So another learning just on this conversation I'm having is actually we're looking at a pretty small part of that bigger continuum. And that is developmental conversations that are about growth and learning. And why is it important to us in coaching and education? That's what all educators do. So the kind of things we're talking about here, of course, they're relevant for coaches, instructional coaches, mentors. But I think the beauty or maybe the reason we're both passionate and interested about this is our recognition. I mean, we've both been educators. I would say we both still are educators. So we're part of this as well. And that, I guess, the idea of being intentional about where am I on that smaller continuum, that's one question. But the other thing you raise, which is a very interesting point, is what we choose to call ourselves. And, the moment I say to you, I'm an instructional coach, you might have certain expectations if you were my coachee. If I say to you, I'm a mentor, I think you would have and should have certain expectations about what I know or what I don't know or what influence I have. And equally, if we say I am a coach, that might have implications. And again, it's a similar tension. This is the book that you mentioned. In this book, Professional Coaching, John Campbell, our founding director, and I came back to this. And again, the purpose of this was because we're working in partnership with Instructional Coaching Group, and personally, I've learned so much from Jim Knight and the work that he does. We were trying to figure out how do all of these different approaches align. But again, to be fair, we've come up with a table here, which there's that similar trap of once we put something in a table, it's going to look less fluid and less dynamic than we want to. But in that table, what we were doing was, again, we're looking at the same continuum, I guess, and saying, well, mentoring would be closer to the directive side of our smaller continuum, that our approach, the GCI approach, could be called facilitative, or but certainly closer to the non-directive end. And the Jim's instructional coaching approach is dialogic in its very nature. It's a dialogic approach. So it would fall somewhere in between. And as I've described that, I'm happier with that description than even the table, because the table again turns into these. What are your reflections there?
The table is a bone of contention as well, and that's what I said earlier. I love a good diagram and I love a good summary illustration of these things. But again, as soon as you put things in columns, it looks like you're there or you're there at the silos. And when I'm actually commentating on that, when I do, there's one in the impact cycle as well. Okay, we're doing books today. Here's another book. There's a version of that table in here, and it explains facilitative, dialogical, and directive. And I would always say, look, directive, I wouldn't call it coaching. Some of you might call it mentoring. But sometimes there needs to be more of me in that conversation. They don't know what they don't know. They need some advice or suggestions on something. And I might direct a little bit, but it's not giving directives. And most of the time it helps people think and act as professionals if we stay in the facilitative end. But again, as I'm discussing it on a slide, I'm doing this. Rather than sliding, I'm going, let's hop here, and then let's hop there. And it needs that physical, or imaginary movement, if you like, because something else you said there that made me think. You said, where am I in this continuum?
Mm-hmm.
Where am I in this table? It's where do I need to be, I think, for this person at this time.
Yes.
And actually this person at this time. It's not where do I need to be for this whole conversation. So that notion of being responsive to the needs of that individual in the moment, again, is advanced coaching, isn't it? And it's advanced helping, if you like. One other thing I want to mention just before we need to go to the questions, because this is great, and I'm getting too excited now. That movement, the notion of where do I need to be, and how much of me, how much of my voice do I need to inject into this, but then also being aware that I might need to move back to a more helpful stance, a different kind of stance. And on that notion of that word helping, which is a challenging word in itself, we might think it's really obvious. We all, as humans, and the book we often cite is by Edgar Schein, a book called Helping by Edgar Schein.
Yeah.
And he reckons it's a Western cultural norm to see helping equals, there it is, we're doing the plugs tonight, it's going to be a big list for Andrea to put together after this one. But helping equals telling. Helping equals, even when you see someone that just had really awful news, difficult situation, helping equals making them feel better by telling them what we think. And we've all got that in us. And actually, I've often said teachers are probably the worst manifestations of it. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous. Repeat after me. My name's Chris, and I'm a recovering advice giver. We've got it so ingrained that part of what this continuum helps us do is pull ourselves away, even temporarily, but actually then realize that people don't always need to hear, and actually a lot of the time they don't need to hear what we think, and they don't need to hear the fonts of wisdom that we've got in our heads.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying to me once about a coaching conversation a long time ago, that if I know what I'm going to say next before they've stopped talking, then it means I've been thinking of my answer and my solution or my question in my head, and I've not been fully present for them in that moment.
Yeah.
So we need to set aside, when we go to that facilitative end, or even any of those ends, we're setting aside our own chatter and our own solution building, if you like, to see what they've got. And most of the time, again, one of your little mantras is they've got it. You're saying to yourself, you've got this. I think the continuum encourages us to step away from where our default or comfort kind of tendency might be.
Yes.
What questions? I think it's 7 beside the box there. I think it is, Chris.
We will go to that. May I just respond
to
yes. what you've said? Because again, this is why these conversations are so helpful. So I'm even noticing as you're talking about this. So it comes back to the helping thing. So first of all, I think most educators want to help, and probably that's why we're educators. So that's probably, I don't know, it's not maybe scientifically or statistically proven, but I would hazard a guess that many of us are driven by wanting to help others. But that's also the same for coaches. So I think, again, there's a point of many people who come into coaching want to help. And so what you've said there, incredibly helpful. And this is a kind of in the moment thing I just wanted to share. So I guess our intention here in having this conversation is to be helpful to other educators. And I found myself, even in this conversation, starting to think about when Chris finishes talking about this. Isn't it interesting? But I think there's a big part, which is just the noticing. And again, because of this situation, this is a recorded conversation. If it were just you and me, that would be less of a pressure for me. But because I'm thinking we've got other people listening to this and we want to be as helpful as possible, I'm finding myself a little bit drawn towards, when do we go to the questions? When do we? And that's another example of, even as we're talking about this and I'm doing my best, our minds can be drawn to those things. And I think the first thing, the helpful thing to do is to notice those.
I think what you're raising there is something that we talk about when we do our training programs, is the kind of listening we're doing with each other just now is conversational listening.
Yeah.
That we're where we are turn taking, we
Yeah.
are responding, we're building on each other's thoughts. None of us is providing a helping service to the other,
No.
really intentionally.
Yeah.
And you might say we're taking a dialogical approach because we're thinking together,
I
but
think
no one of us is there as the designated coach or mentor or have a label. So there's a different kind of listening that we're probably doing. So we give ourselves permission to think a little bit ahead.
yeah.
And to think, if I was truly being present here trying to coach you, I would be trying to set that aside
Yeah.
and park it somewhere until it might be needed, but it might not be needed.
Excellent. So on that continuum now, we're probably towards the middle of that in a kind of a dialogic mode where we're both, because this is a developmental conversation, certainly for me. So this does fit within our continuum, this conversation, because I'm learning as we're having the conversation, but I'm not being in a facilitative, completely non-directive role. And I'm not being in a mentoring role. I'm not sharing, oh, this is what I'm thinking about this. This is genuinely, we're kind of learning together, I think. So on that note, shall we turn to the questions?
Okay.
So to everyone, thank you for providing these questions. As other questions emerge, please just type them in. We want you to be part of our conversation. So I think I'm going to look for a question that really resonates with me and just pose it to Chris, because you're good at this stuff. I like this. Right. So let's look at the first question that's up there. How do we need to initiate a meaningful conversation and keep the interest alive throughout the conversation? So if I can summarize the question, the way I'm hearing it is, how do you signal to somebody this is going to be a meaningful conversation? And then how do you keep that at that level throughout?
Okay, so because this isn't live with the person being able to give you further clarification, we'll try. The term meaningful conversation intrigues me. Like, what makes a conversation meaningful?
Maybe developmental.
Developmental. So meaningful in terms of, if Jim might say that it's a life-giving conversation, we both walk away richer for having it. You know, that's one. But actually, meaningful in that the person who you're serving in the conversation, supporting, helping, moves somewhere in their thinking. If it's dialogue, we both walk out with something we didn't walk in with. Can't remember who I'm quoting there, but there's something there. I think the initiation, how do you initiate it? You need a point of reference. I do think that if this was a coaching conversation or a mentoring conversation, they're not just a chat, they're not just a conversation. So you're there to talk about something. And now we can talk about perceptions. We can talk about another conversation you and I need to have about sources of reality. You and Jim raised it last week.
Yes.
But that notion of what's the current reality, and if I put it a different way, how do you know what's currently happening other than just your perception? Can we look at data? Could we look at some video? Could I watch you run a meeting or teach a class or whatever? Have you done an evaluation tool? I think having the coach or mentor or the helper there, the person leading the conversation and managing it, and the person who's seeking that help with their thinking, but having a third point in that conversation that is the point of reference, that makes it more meaningful. And I think the other thing that makes it much more meaningful and easier to initiate is if let's call them the coachee or the person you're trying to help, is in the driving seat. They're initiating it. They're soliciting the conversation in the first place, which suggests that they're motivated by it and they see the need for something to be different. So part of that is, how do you get someone to be that position where they're a solution focused phrase we often use is they're a customer for change. They're looking for something to be different or better, and they need help nutting it out and moving forward on it. Therefore, that conversation is initiated in itself. That's ideally what we want. I don't think you initiate it in a forceful way, because people will just passively comply then. So there's probably more to that, but that might answer it. Yeah,
I love it. Excellent answer. And I was thinking when you were talking about the reality thing, which we do need to talk about, what Jim says, and I think we all agree. And in our own global framework for coaching and mentoring and education, we've put student success and well-being right at the heart. So I think one way to keep it meaningful and interesting is if we start from that. If we start from the goal itself is something that educators will be passionate about, perhaps. So have you got a question out of there for me?
I can see some well-known names there that we are friends and colleagues.
Oh, wonderful.
I've not got to Rachel's long one yet. I'll get to that in a second. But actually, Nick, hello, Nick. That's the next one for you, actually, Christian. You know, I'm wondering who we serve.
Oh.
What leader is it? What leadership wants, or that's an interesting word. Or drawing out the expertise in the other. I'm thinking coaching is about enhancing the individual. Please comment. And then, all right, yeah, that's okay. So who do we serve when we're in these conversations, given that we're operating in a school system? Christian?
First of all, Nick, thank you for that question, and for all the work you're doing, Nick. And I love the phrase, who are we serving? I think that is the driving question for anyone who calls themselves a coach, whether you're an instructional coach or any other type of a coach. And I think the nuance around the who are we serving, I'm not putting myself forward as an expert here, because I'm not. So all I want to do is share how I've come to terms with this, if that's okay, Chris, which is, I got into coaching initially to serve the person sitting in front of me. That was my main driver. And I was thinking, I'm here to be of service to this person. And when I was thinking about how do these concepts apply in educational settings, my perspective changed a lot. And for me now, I think what coaches are doing in schools, and this is all over the world, they're doing this already, is that they are trying to be of service to the person sitting in front of them or standing in, or working with them, the other educator, but bearing in mind that ultimately it's being of service to the education community as a whole, but very clearly and very specifically for me, it is about being of service to the learner. And this, the learner in the classroom, I think that's what coaching and education is all about, being of service to them ultimately. But we do that by being of service to the educators we're working with. And that connects to your point, Chris. The starting point, the element of choice is critical. Educators are very talented professionals. As Jim has said, they are professionals who think for a living. So the coaching is a very respectful way of helping educators to be better if they want to be better.
Yeah.
And then the reason we're having these conversations ultimately is to be of service to learners. And that's why I think when we're setting goals for educators, educational leaders, having a connection back to, well, does achieving this goal further student success and well-being in your context, whatever that context is?
I like that. And I think actually, so looking through some of these others, Christian, it's issues that we thought might come up anyway. So this could be the rest of the conversation on these. There's some really good ones. Nick, can I just add a tiny bit to that, Christian?
Please.
I think it's another one of those tensions that Nick is raising there, that in some of the programs this comes up as well, that there's a tension between, there's an improvement agenda, let's put it that way. And you could say that the word improvement is loaded and contentious and all the rest of it pejorative. But that sometimes manifests itself as school leaders under pressure to raise results, raise attainment, improve student outcomes in some measurable way. And therefore, we're going to have these people in school called coaches or whatever they're called. And I'll come to Lucy's question in a minute. There's a short answer to that one. They're there as a service, as a professional learning service, to improve the performance of the teachers. And then that can be read as teachers are doing a rotten job just now and they need to improve their performance, or it could be read as teachers are professionals who are always striving to get better at doing what they do for the benefit of the students, in which case this is a normal thing that we should all be doing. And I think I'm more subscribed to that view, to be blunt. But I think the other tension that you're raising there, Nick, is that sometimes with good intent, but it actually causes problems for the coaches, a principal or another leader will refer people to the coach for treatment.
Yeah.
And that comes up quite often and when we talk about instructional coaches, you're the instructional experts in the building, you have some expertise, and that and the principal sends people to you to make them better. You know, and well, you know what's going to happen there, Christian. That's the same as in your executive coaching experience, where a client tells you that they've got this leader who needs some coaching. Can you come and sort them out for me? And you get them sitting there going, well, go on, coach me. So I don't think there's a straight answer to that, but I think what you're doing is you're highlighting there that there are these tensions, and the answer to that, to me, comes down to pretty robust role clarity and robust conversations between the leaders and the people who are doing the coaching. And that's often a result of some of the programs we do. The first thing they're going to go and do is go and have a conversation with a boss to say this is what the job should be. So there's a lot in that. Can I just answer Lucy's one about titles first, just quickly? That comes up regularly, Lucy. Thank you for asking that. That the term coach is appearing in job titles in schools associated with roles around learning. What are the strengths and potential limitations of this development? I think the limitations jump up and bite us first. I arrived here in 2011 to a school where there were 3-4 different professional learning leadership kind of roles with different kind of remits. And there were, I think, 3 coaches in the school: a digital learning coach, a numeracy coach, and a literacy coach. And no fault of the school, I really should add, nothing wrong with what the school was doing. All of those had been given the title and the badge by the Department of Education, but very, very little training on how to be that thing, that job. And we see that all over the country. And we saw it in America when you and I, Christian, were there in Kansas last year. Even with established instructional coaching programs, yes, people are given a badge, a title, and then left to work out, sometimes inadvertently left to work out how they do it and make the role for themselves. So I think sometimes the titles get in the way. I think they're always going to be loaded in one way or another, or people will have perceptions of what they mean. I think what really matters is not the title, it's how you define the role and how you do what we'll call contracting and coaching. You know, you establish what it is and what it isn't, and what you can do for people and not do for people, and you delineate between that leadership space and appraisal, accountability space, and a supportive developmental space. So in some ways, I don't really care what you call them, because people are going to call them their own titles anyway. But I think sometimes it can be unhelpful.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And this ties into another question. To what degree do we really need such definite definition rather than going with the flow? And I'll say that one quickly, because I do want to get to Rachel's longer question. You know, I've not come to a decision on this, and this is one of those things I've tussled with. Is I started off by saying it doesn't really matter what you call yourself. This does actually relate to Rachel's question, but we'll address that separately. I have said before, look, it doesn't really matter as long as there's a person there who's interested in supporting the development of others. If they're caring and they try to meet the needs of that person. I was thinking, look, you can call yourself anything you like. That's what we want. And now I've kept moving on that, and I'm still ambivalent about it, because there was a time when I was saying, actually, for the sake of for coaching and education as a field, we need clarity. From a research point of view, we need clarity, because you cannot research something which could be, it could be anything, and they could be called anything. You have to be quite precise in research to say the person with this title is doing this thing and it's happening consistently. So I moved at one point, I was thinking it's probably worth getting this clarified. And I'm still ambivalent. I'm not really sure. I can see the benefits of having some role clarity. But if we can come to Rachel's question, and I just want to acknowledge Professor Rachel Lofthouse, one of the leading thinkers in this field. So thank you, Rachel, for being on this call. And one of the other people, I'm very lucky to have a number of people that I love to have these kinds of conversations with. So Rachel is one of those people that it's very helpful to have these conversations. So the conversations are reminding me of the role and significance of language in the architecture of practice, as theorized by chemists et al. In their work, they position sayings, oral and written language space, in association with relatings, the social space, and doings, the physical space. Do you think coaches might sometimes be at risk of prioritizing language over the other dimensions? I think yes, definitely. So I don't normally give such clear answers. But because the question is there a risk of that? I would say yes, definitely. If I'm saying, I am this, I'm a mentor, so this is what I'm going to do. You know, that does seem to me to be saying, now that I have this title, this is what I'm going to be able to do. Or equally saying, look, I'm a coach, I'm never going to give you advice. I'm never going to tell you what to do. I think that would be a case of actually putting my role title before what's in the best interest. And that comes back to I think as educators, the prime driver is being of service. What's the best, and you said it already, Chris, in this conversation. In this conversation with this person at this time, what's the best way that I can be of service? And a point we haven't really talked about that I did want to just throw in here. May I do that, Chris?
Yeah.
Which is, I recall with my good colleague Susan Bentley in South Africa, it wasn't that many weeks ago, we were delivering a training program and we were able to go outside to do this, talk about this continuum. So a whole group of educators from South Africa, we were out on a beautiful outdoor space. And the question I had was, if you think about this continuum, where is your preference? And I do think that's something we haven't talked about specifically here. We've alluded to it, but being aware of my preference is towards the non-directive side of this smaller continuum, or my preference is towards the directive, or my preference, that will help as well, because we have to determine, am I moving towards this non-directive or directive or dialogic or facilitative or directive approach because that's what I like to do when I'm helping people? Or am I being driven by the best interest of being of service, etc.? So that's probably a long answer to that.
Yeah, I think I'd need longer to wrestle with that. I do remember those three terms, doing, sayings, and relatings. I remember Rachel using those in a keynote at our conference 4 years ago, I think it was, Rachel. And they struck me. I remember she laughed at the time and said, none of them are real words either, you know, but doings, relating, and sayings in that context, or it's not grammatically correct, but it did make me think about the physical space of coaching on a very practical level. It made me think of, how do I set up the environment for the conversation? It's not just what we say, it's where and how, and all the relationship, all that. I think that's a nice broad way of thinking about it. There's two, I think, Christian, that I might want to take together. And actually, the coincidence here is Daniel Steele, hi Dan, and Mary Claire Relihan are both PhD students at Monash University right now, and friends and colleagues of ours. But I think they're related. So Dan has said that considering a coaching conversation in a teaching context, let's say mathematics, so like a numeracy coach, maths coach, how important is the lived experience and content or pedagogical knowledge of the coach within that conversation? So this is really an instructional coaching question. But then Mary Claire, interested to hear our thoughts on how a continuum of coaching conversations could impact mentoring within initial teacher education and training. Now that's the one close to my heart, Mary Claire, because I spent 5 years in initial teacher education in Aberdeen, and we were called mentors. We went out and supervised and assessed and tried to have developmental conversations with beginning teachers. Now, if there aren't as many tensions in that conversation, I don't know whether there are more. They knew I was measuring them. They knew I was out with a checklist of teaching standards, but I was also trying to pretend it was developmental. And I think the best of those were more dialogical than they were more like instructional coaching than mentoring. They knew I had expertise. That's why I was in the training role. But they also knew up front when the contracting and clarity was done really well, pre-conversation, they knew that there was an assessment piece to that conversation. But actually the other big part of my purpose in being there was to engage them in analysis and meaningful dialogue about their practice in a way that I'd allowed them to identify tangible next steps that we could then pick up on either back on campus or the next time they were back in the classroom. Now, for me now, knowing more about instructional coaching, that's basically what I was doing when it went well. I was being very cautious of when and I'd probably be better at it now, when I injected into that conversation some of my, Daniel's point, some of my pedagogical knowledge or content knowledge that they needed. But I think there's a danger that we just assume that all beginning teachers are empty vessels. And you know as well as I do that they're definitely not. And a lot of them you point in the right direction and off they go. So they need a more facilitative coaching conversation. So I didn't have any of that language or any of that understanding or even any of that training when I was doing it in teacher training. But I know that the ones that went less well and met more resistance were the ones that were too directive too soon.
Yeah,
I think that's clear. And Daniel's question, I think the tension there or the nuance for you there is, at what point do you bring your pedagogical knowledge onto the table? And it may well be when they're exploring options, when they don't know how to improve something in the students that they want to get better at, and you've got some ideas and you've got suggestions, but it's not a prescriptive, here's how I do it. It's, I'm throwing some things into that pot of options or pool of options. And because I bring expertise to the table. But when they're owning it and moving it forward, you'll shift back to a facilitative stance to help them own it and move it in next steps and so on. So I think that answers maybe both. I hope it does. Happy to talk further.
Thank you very much, Chris. There were a few other questions, but I think it might be helpful to bring our conversation, this conversation, to a gentle close. And I'd like to do that, Chris, by appreciating what you've brought to this conversation, which is enormous. And I think why that is an enormous contribution is because of your practical lived experience of doing this, and you brought a lot of that into the conversation, that when you were doing initial teacher training, etc., when you were in school. So that's so valuable. But it's also because you're a great listener, you're great at having conversations. And I think if we'd positioned ourselves somewhere else on this continuum, it wouldn't have been such an enriching conversation. So first of all, I wanted to appreciate you and for sharing and being honest with those insights. I want to also acknowledge two other people. So Andrea Stringer, she's our wonderful colleague, managing consultant for New South Wales and ACT. Andrea's the person who's managing this whole series of Curious Conversations. She's communicating about it, getting people excited about it. And so I just wanted, there were a few other questions that had come up, but I wanted to say we'll use those conversations, and we're working with Andrea to bring them into the conversation. Two things I've already thought that triggered by the questions. One is about the relationship with leadership. There was a question about leadership approaches. I think that's that deserves another conversation between people who have that expertise. And I know Andrea's already probably connecting and thinking, this person talks about leadership and education, etc. So there'll be another conversation about that. And so our intention at GCI is to continue to have these curious conversations where we're learning as well. So they're not meant to be didactic. We're not meant to be saying, oh, this is how we might do something. It's really, wanting to broaden out the conversations. And the other person I want to acknowledge is Jess Joyles. Jess is a key member of our business services team at Growth Coaching International. She's often behind the scenes on these kinds of webinars, but she's really essential and very reassuring presence for us to make sure everything goes smoothly, that we're communicating well with everyone. So I wanted to acknowledge Jess as well. So thank you very much, Chris. Over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you. And just to second everything you've said, it's a mutual appreciation round now, but definitely thank you for those kind words. It's always a joy to have these conversations. I think as we both relaxed into that conversation, because it's always a bit odd not knowing who's watching, and we can see each other's faces, but not everybody else going to sleep in the background. But I think it got more conversational. I hope it was helpful to everybody. I get the absolute joy of having these conversations on a fairly regular basis now. It's such a privilege, it really is. So hopefully when we get this recorded and we be able to answer some of those other questions maybe in a different way. I can see there's a lot of alerts on Twitter as well. We'll keep it going. Keep it going.
Brilliant.
All right.
Thank you very much, everyone. And
thanks, everybody.
It's been great talking. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Christian.